I'm Rebecca French. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. I first of all like to thank Lynn Stoddard and the Institute for Sustainable Energy for inviting us today and for hosting this incredible event where a lot of people have been talking about resilience. So I'm feeling like we should have pitched in more because you're really giving a great opportunity for municipalities to talk about the work that they're not only doing on sustainability and energy and climate adaptation. And it's a lesson to me that even though I work at an institute that, we do resilience, we do adaptation, you do sustainability, we do energy, the municipalities are thinking about these things together as a holistic problem. So we need to work together as an institute, so I'm really happy to be here today with you. So circa, very briefly, our mission is to assist vulnerable communities along coastal and inland waterways to the impacts of climate change and severe weather on the natural, built, and human environment. We have a couple of permanent staff, myself, a program manager, and our executive director is Jim O'Donnell, who's a professor in marine sciences. Our executive steering committee is co-chaired by the commissioner of DEEP and the vice president for research. And we engage UConn faculty from across the university as well as DEEP staff, many of whom are here in the audience today. We also run, in addition to our research activities on storm surge, waves, sea level rise, precipitation, impacts of climate change, we also work on policy analysis and design, as well as infrastructure vulnerability issues. And we run 2 funding programs, one that we just recently announced, the Municipal Resilience Grants Program. We have a poster out in the hallway that talks a little bit more about that, but applications are due October 15th. We are having a webinar this coming Monday, September 21st at 11 a.m. I'll provide some information. It's on our website, and we'll provide some information to Lynn in case you want to join us and learn more about that program. I've already run out of time to introduce my speakers today. So first of all, I would just like to say that the impacts that they're dealing with right now are that by the end of the century, we expect to have 1 to 4 feet in sea level rise, by some estimates, maybe as much as 6 feet of sea level rise. That's on top of when storms hit our coast. You're going to have storm surge on top of sea level rise, impacts from waves, as well as precipitation. It's particularly a concern for those communities that lie at the confluence of rivers and the sound, of which Old Saybrook does along the Connecticut River. These towns are at different stages in a planning process. Old Saybrook is just getting started. I learned that this Tuesday they presented their recommendations to the municipal staff. It was a volunteer committee. So they've just made their first recommendations on addressing sea level rise in the town of Old Saybrook. Guilford is much further in the process. They've been at this for 3 years, developing a coastal resiliency plan. It's quite comprehensive. They had support from multiple grants from the Nature Conservancy as well as Yale. And so they're going to talk today about that planning process. These planning processes are ongoing in many coastal communities, thanks in part, sadly, to Sandy recovery funds. And the good use of them is that they are going towards future planning for disasters. So you're going to be hearing more about these coastal resiliency plans that are going on a town-by-town basis. So I'd like to underscore, again, something that many speakers have said today, that I hope you're listening to each other across municipalities. These are regional issues. They're shared across municipalities. So as you hear their stories, I hope that you will hear some of the shared problems that you have and that we can come together to find solutions that work for multiple sites in Connecticut. So with that, I'd like to introduce Larry from Old Saybrook.
So one is I would also like to thank everyone for allowing us to come today and talk to you about our experience in Old Saybrook. One of the taglines I had when I was going to finish this was there are a lot of big problems out there, so get started now. And what I just heard about Bridgeport is I'm really impressed that they've not only gotten started, but they're well on their way to fixing a lot of this stuff. And so I found that very encouraging. So I represent the committee in Old Saybrook, citizen at large. And so we were appointed by our first selectman to form a committee on sea level rise and adaptation to climate change. And so we got started on May 8th, about a year and a half ago, not quite a year and a half ago, and we're going to raise awareness of the sea level problem. We're going to utilize the best science data and models to identify impacted areas and problems. We're going to make recommendations to the town's administration based on that data, and then we wanted to educate the residents around this issue. And as Rebecca just said, we made our recommendations. We proposed our proposed recommendations to the First Selectman and the Board of Finance on Tuesday, and our final report will be finished by the end of the year. So what's currently being done in Old Saybrook, and we are at the confluence of Long Island Sound and the Connecticut River. We have made some changes in the town to the regulatory, the building code, flood plan ordinance, and the National Flood Insurance Program. We certainly have included our natural hazard mitigation plan that's been approved by FEMA and become part of the town plan. That's POCD. We're looking for help. We're looking for best practices. We're looking for sources of funding. And we've been partnering with other organizations. The Nature Conservancy certainly has been helpful in a couple of aspects, and I'll point those out as we go along. One of the things that the Nature Conservancy has helped us do, and certainly we are facing big issues, we're going to have to plan accordingly. We're going to have to secure funds. Old Saybrook is not going to solve sea level rise in that little part of the coast. Neither is the Connecticut going to solve this on their own, so we're looking for help. But one of the things that we're lacking, of course, is funds. And with the help of Clark University and the Nature Conservancy, we've been able to put together a survey, and it turns out that people on the shoreline, at least Old Saybrook as well as Waterford, are actually willing to invest in means to save their community and preserve what they value in that community, and they actually put a dollar value on that. So these kinds of things are going to be very helpful to us going forward, because we can go to the voters, hopefully the First Selectman, and say, you're willing, basically, based on our survey, we found that you're willing to spend an extra X amount of dollars per acre of beach that we think we can save if we get a good resiliency plan or a coastal engineer coming in to help us do these sorts of things. And so our thanks to the Nature Conservancy with that work. Very briefly, we're a population of about 10,000 people. Again, we're on at the mouth of the Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. And our coastline, we have a lovely 6 miles of coastline on Long Island Sound. We end up with another 17 miles of coastline on the Connecticut River, giving us a total of around 23 miles of coastline for a town of 10,000 people. So we do have significant risk as sea level continues to rise. When we look at how we're distributed, I-95 goes through there, and if you ever travel that way, basically, if you look to the right of that I-95 bridge going on your way back up to Boston or something like that, you'll see that most of our population likes to live south of I-95. And if you look at those residential areas, it's been built up over time. There are a lot of small lots, a lot of very high-density housing along the shoreline. If you look at the 2,000 or so homes that are in the 100-year flood range, about 35% of the residents in Old Saybrook qualify. If you look at the homes that are in the 500-year flood, basically we get another 21%. So about 55% of our residences are within the 500-year flood zone or 100-year flood zone. So a significant portion of our tax base is at risk with sea level rise and climate change, which will include more frequent and severe storms. What we did was we went out, we tried to find a source of data that we could use. We used the NOAA data that was the report that was generated by the Army Corps of Engineers. We kind of looked at this. We're looking in the near term and the future, basically 20 years out and 70 years out, and we tried to be conservative in making estimates about how we would approach this. So 20 years from now, we're banking on or using 1 foot of sea level rise as our sort of baseline to plan for. And then in the 70 years out, we're looking at a baseline of about 4 feet to plan for. People always ask us, well, that's really conservative. Why are you doing it like that? And for obvious reasons, right? You don't want to take, plan for 1 foot of sea level rise in 70 years, and if you end up with 4 feet, then all of your planning is for naught. We hope it doesn't get to be that much. Hope's not a strategy, and so we continue to force people to kind of look at things that can be done or should be done. So we're trying to get started now. One of the things we've done that really has a lot of impact when we're out there trying to educate our community, we take a look at, and we're blessed with having Sandy Prislow, who is our environmental planner for Old Saybrook, who can make these kinds of maps for us. There's storm surge Sandy, and this is basically the town of Old Saybrook, I-95 going up here, and this is our 6 miles and then 17 miles of coastline up here. And we get inundation in these blue areas with Sandy, and so you can see these shoreline communities right there. It's a place called Chalker Beach, basically. They get flooded. So we go in and say, okay, what if we go 4 feet? And basically all that red basically includes homes that will be inundated with 4 feet. Oops. That's on top of the sea level surge by Sandy. And so you don't need to look at these very carefully unless you're in Old Saybrook, because everyone who lives in Old Saybrook will come up and say, well, where's my house? And I can tell you my house is right there. So what it is a tool that we use. It's an impactful tool to get people to focus, saying that there's going to be change if these changes come true based on the best data that we currently have and the modeling that's been done. You know, we're going to have to make some pretty hard choices, and we're going to have to start planning on how we're going to manage that now. So the committee recommendations, basically, we broke it down into the environment, the community, the economics. The questions we ask are, where are we going, and how are we going to get there? So where are we? We're a shoreline community. Where are we going? We have our beaches and our marshes that are endangered of being lost because of sea level rise. You know, where would we like to go? We would like to preserve those, and how are we going to do that? And so one of the things you can do is purchase land or try to make arrangements for sea level, as sea level rise comes up, basically, to have the marshes be able to migrate so you sustain healthy marshes surrounding your community, which is one of the things that provides one of the valued things in Old Saybrook that people come to enjoy and people that live there appreciate. Our recommendations, and I'm trying to get through this in a rather quick manner because we've got a lot of good information from Guilford coming up next. Basically, what our very high-level recommendations were to incorporate sea level rise in all the town planning. And that seems pretty simple, but sea level rise has continued to become a bigger and more important issue. And so some of the town plans have not taken it into account, certainly not the most recent data. So they must do that going forward. We must do that. Establish a committee or a staff to maintain a focus on sea level rise. As many of you know, basically the data is changing. Since the Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change came out from the United Nations, the data has been reanalyzed, and it appears, according to some analysis, that the rate of sea level rise may be greater than what was anticipated even a year and a half ago. Form a citizens advisory group. We need to have citizens being actively involved and understand what the options are, so when other neighborhoods within Old Saybrook get together, they can say, well, what are my options? What do I have to do for zoning? How can I get involved? We want to hire a grant writer because, again, you're going to need funds, and we need to have somebody whose focus will be to continue to watch for those sorts of things. And the town government does do that, but certainly because of the extent and the nature and the complexity and the amount of attention being given to sea level rise, we think it's important to have a grant writer. And most important, we need a coastal resiliency plan. And coastal resiliency plans come in lots of different forms and variations, and what's included in those. One is, of course, we need a coastal geologist to come in and give us part of that plan so we can plan accordingly, because where you sit, a point in Old Saybrook may be different from the beach in Old Saybrook. How you protect that beach with a dike or a groin or a living shoreline changes based on where the currents come from and where the wind comes from. So it's really a complicated thing that the citizen at large here doesn't quite understand all that, and so we need expert help in terms of our resiliency plan. And the final thing we put up there was install a tide gauge, and we probably put that up because we got that accomplished in the last year and a half. And now online you can go and find out what the tide is doing in Old Saybrook, what sea level rise is doing, as well as the wind direction and the velocity. So our charge to the community, basically, learn about and understand the problem. Provide feedback to the committee and the town staff, get involved in this, host an information session, talk with your family and friends, and understand the fiscal impacts on individuals in the town, because again, a large part of our tax base will be at risk if the current predictions of sea level rise are going to come true. So what I've got, I think I've stayed close to on time, but what I started with again was that we're facing big issues, and so if you live in a community that hasn't begun to look at this or have a focus on that, get started, because it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of thought to come up with solutions. We don't know what those solutions are. As the committee that's been at it for a year and a half, it's pretty easy to pick out what some of the big problems are. It's not so easy to figure out what those solutions are, so get started right away. Second, educate your community. If the community is educated and is in favor of continuing to plan and for mitigation of these things, it doesn't matter who the first selectman is, they'll recognize that the town in general is in support of doing things to continue to plan and mitigate against that. And finally, reach out, ask for help, and that help comes in form of partnering, best practices, funds, and actually I'm looking forward to hearing what George has to say, because they certainly are much further along than Old Saybrook is. They're beyond that sort of a plan. They've been implementing some things, and so at this point, that's it. Citizen at large, Larry, is signing off. So.
Nice job, Larry. Larry's covered a lot of the same type of ground that the town of Guilford has covered in the development of its coastal resilience plan. I'm not going to go through the entire slideshow I have. It's quite extensive, and we do have limited time here, and I think it would be worthwhile to try to engage you with some questions and answers, hopefully, talking about in particular, long-range planning, which is what coastal resilience planning is really all about. And in the case, at least with Old Saybrook and Guilford, relatively small towns. How many of you in the audience live in or work in coastal communities in Connecticut? Okay, good. Quite a few of you. That's great. You obviously then know the issues that we're dealing with. In the case of Guilford, we started our planning process about 4 years ago. Very similar situation to Old Saybrook, very similar type community. In our case, we were fortunate to have the Nature Conservancy as a full partner in our project. Some of you may know that the Nature Conservancy has developed a sea level rise tool that enables you to visualize various sea level rise scenarios in Connecticut and see how those scenarios might impact specific properties. If we get far enough in the slideshow, you'll see some examples of that. It's important that you can do the same thing in your community. Guilford has an approved coastal resilience plan that was developed in cooperation, as I mentioned, with the Nature Conservancy. We also had the assistance of Yale University, the Yale so-called Urban Ecology Laboratory, which is a joint venture between the Architecture School and the Yale School of Environmental Studies. And we did have a grant from NOAA, which enabled us to hire a consultant who are identified on this graphic, Malone and McBroom, and the four partners, the town, the Nature Conservancy, Yale, and Malone and McBroom really developed this plan. Let's see. I'm not going to go through this whole presentation agenda. If you want to see the coastal resilience plan that we've developed, you can go to the Town of Guilford website and find it there. There are three components to it. The first is the so-called vulnerability assessment, which is a significant document that attempts to describe all the elements of Guilford that are vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal storms. The second document is a discussion of options that the town has to try to address coastal resilience issues. And then the third is the actual plan itself, which was just completed last year. The plan describes a process or recommends a process for implementing the improvements and the activities that are described in the plan. And I really want to talk mostly about the implementation process here right now. The plan, the Coastal Resilience Plan, was approved about 4 months ago by the Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission and incorporated into the town's so-called Plan of Conservation and Development, which most of you are probably familiar with, thus making the Coastal Resilience Plan a part of the official policy of the town with regard to land use. The Coastal Resilience Plan has the elements that were described a few moments ago. You know what coastal resilience is. Why should we have a plan is a really good question. It's interesting to me that Guilford's plan came together about the same time as the residents and property owners of Guilford were experiencing Irene and then Sandy. So the issues of flooding and sea level rise and the impact on our lifestyle and our community, our property, were very much in people's minds at the time, and that really brought the whole issue of coastal resilience planning to a head in Guilford. I'm wondering myself, if we never had Irene and Sandy, if the people of the town would have invested the kind of energy and attention that they did to this coastal resilience planning process. Right now, we look outside, it's fall, it's the type of season when we might expect to have storms. Everything looks beautiful. Our coastal communities are beautiful, and I can sense myself the urgency that people felt 2 or 3 years ago is no longer there. But we're asking people to address an issue that's going to have impacts from 25 and 50 and 100 years from now, and that it's very hard for people to focus on that, no doubt about it. I think, as our previous speaker talked about, we need to put in place institutional arrangements that will create a long-term structure that will then focus on these issues and attempt to concentrate the town's energies and attentions over the long term. Our project went through a whole stage of assessing vulnerabilities and risks. There's a lot of graphic material here, which I'm going to skip through to get to some pictures because I know those are more interesting. This is what the Nature Conservancy Resilience Tool looks like. You can see it enables us to project how coastal inundation, what it'll look like in 2080 compared to a Category 2 hurricane today. It's very hard for you to visualize that where you're sitting, I'm sure, unless you know Guilford in detail. This is what our coastline looks like. We have some pictures of flooding, of course. The types of properties that are vulnerable include residential, commercial, institutional, and so forth. Again, lots of pictures of the kinds of issues that the town of Guilford faces. I'd like to get through some of this and get to the point where we see some pictures about options and where we go from here. We took a look at our vulnerabilities by geography, and this is a really important kind of focus that our plan has. Guilford's coastline is broken up into a half a dozen very distinct neighborhoods, which are very different in many ways. And one of the most important recommendations of our plan is that fine-grained, detailed, neighborhood-based plans looking at the specific issues of sea level rise in those neighborhoods are really necessary in order to accomplish the infrastructure improvements that the plan calls for, in order to identify the infrastructure improvements, to identify the resilience structures that might be required, and to, most importantly, perhaps identify what types of land use and regulatory decisions we need to make. So we're really pushing our neighborhoods to organize themselves, and some of them have really done this already, partly prompted by the experience of Irene and Sandy, to organize themselves to develop, with the town's assistance, fine-grained neighborhood-based plans, which will look at houses that may be vulnerable in the near term, specific properties that may be vulnerable over a relatively short period of time, properties that may need to be acquired, properties that may need to be redeveloped, and each neighborhood come up with its own set of recommendations. These are some of the neighborhoods in Guilford. Some of you may be familiar with them. Again, they're quite different. Their configurations are quite different. The physical structures are quite different. I'm sorry, I have way too many slides here to really focus on what we're talking about. Lots of graphics that help illustrate and educate our citizens about what's important, as Larry was talking about in a few minutes, and we're almost out of time already, and I wanted to give everybody a chance to ask some questions. Where we are with implementation, and Larry talked about this in his presentation too, local governments in Guilford are balkanized in terms of how they're organized. We have a public works department, we have an engineering department, and planning and zoning, and they kind of go their own direction. We have a chief executive who attempts to organize how we all work together, but local government doesn't work in quite that hierarchical fashion, at least in my experience. And so we have, in this case, a unique set of issues, coastal resilience planning, that kind of fall in between various, or it's not really the right way of putting it, incorporate all of these elements. Public works is involved, emergency services are involved, planning and zoning is involved, the highway department is involved. How do we organize ourselves to specifically focus on coastal resilience over the long term when we might, and hopefully will, have many years of storm-free situations where our attention might not be focused on these questions quite as robustly as they have been over the last few years. Creating institutional structures to address the long-range planning goals, to address the infrastructure improvement goals is really one of the most important things that we need to do. Do we want to create a new town bureaucracy that just focuses on coastal management and coastal issues? Do we want to identify a specific task force or commission, as I think we heard about in Old Saybrook? Perhaps that's a recommendation they're talking about, to continue to address issues of coastal resiliency over the long term. That's one of the most important issues I think we're facing. So we are out of time, unfortunately, but please, I think Larry and I both would very much like to address questions that you have. Thank you. Yes, sir.
The long-term efficacy of your resilience programs and even the long-term viability of your communities is contingent upon the global community stopping climate change. I hope that's clear. Is it clear to your communities? And is climate change mitigation part of what you are doing?
I can't speak for Old Saybrook, but the answer, in Guilford's case, it's not the focus of the Coastal Resilience Plan. The focus of the Coastal Resilience Plan is on what we need to do to react to the and prepare for the inevitabilities associated with the sea level rise and storms trends that we already know are going to be occurring. That doesn't mean that the larger issues of what we do as a people on this earth aren't important. Obviously they are. It's just above our pay grade, at least that's the way we've looked at it in terms of coastal resilience. At the beginning of this process, we had a lot of debate about, is climate change real? What's causing climate change? We had climate change deniers who were saying, why are you wasting all your time on this? And we took the view that we're not really debating whether or not what the cause of climate change is, or whether as a country or as a world we should try to do something about it. What we're trying to focus on here is the fact that these trends are occurring, and if we don't plan for them, if we don't try to address them, we're not doing our jobs as planners. I mean, that's the approach we took. I don't know if Larry has any thoughts on that subject.
No, we had done the same thing. We came to the same conclusion that basically we were focused on looking at what was going to happen based on the current data, and the larger issue of being able to recommend changes as to what we might do to improve the chances of increasing temperatures in the earth. We left that aside as well, just because we're not going to discuss that with the community. We were just basically looking at the issues that were going to be presented with increasing sea level rise and increased frequency and severity of storms. So,
one last question.
I keep
having to look at Lynn and take cues whether I can. So often the conversations around investments in mitigation and adaptation measures focus on the negative economic impacts and the costs involved with that. There's also certainly an economic benefit. There are lots of jobs embedded in all the work that you've envisioned there. And the local economic impact depends on whether those jobs go to local companies and local workers. And I'm wondering whether you've had any conversation about that at the local level in terms of who's going to do the work that's envisioned in these investments and whether it will benefit local companies and the workforces in New London and New Haven, for example.
I can make a very short answer to that. So we haven't gotten to the point where we've committed. A very quick answer to that, and then George may add to it, is basically we haven't gotten to the place in Old Saybrook where there's been any work committed based on our plan yet. So interesting point in terms of how we position this to the community and get buy-in from the community members in terms of where those jobs go. So I hadn't thought about that, so thank you.
The answer, in Guilford, the answer is also no, we haven't really thought of that. The economic issue that I think Guilford faces, and I'm sure it's the same in Old Saybrook, is property values. Guilford's tax base is primarily residential. I think it's like 95% residential. And shoreline property makes up a big part of the residential property tax base. The shoreline property is extremely valuable. It's getting more valuable. Notwithstanding the threats that are obvious and well documented, the property values are continuing to increase. So there's, both from the fiscal municipal point of view, there's a lot of interest in protecting the resources that we have and the tax base that we have, and even more importantly, the residents who own these properties are very interested in making sure that we do the best we can to protect their communities and their resources and their assets. Guilford has invested money already in infrastructure improvements that were identified in the plan. I didn't get to that point in my slideshow because of limited time, but we've already made, as a result of neighborhood pressure, we've made road improvements to road access areas where sea level rise is already compromising the access people have to their neighborhoods. There are a couple of neighborhoods in Guilford which are relatively high, but the access to those neighborhoods is via roads that are flooding even now on a not a daily basis, but a frequent basis, and so we've made those investments.